opposition? In opposition, we have NALSAR-NLS. Just a little word to the audience before we start. Generally speaking, audience interaction is supposed to be kept to a minimum, but when it does exist, should ideally be positive. So let's say no booing if you disagree with things. If you do agree with things, maybe a kind of gentle clap, but not so much the speaker cannot still be heard, especially the judging panel. And second, maybe you think something's funny, a laugh is necessarily reasonable, but just try to keep things positive and try and make sure that you don't drown out the speaker, because obviously it's important to hear what they're saying. The motion before the House is this House believes that the Indian Supreme Court should direct the Royal Bank of India to reprint the entire value of demonetized currency in new banknotes, with an explain what the current finance minister's position on that is. So there are any questions before we start. Well, congratulations to both teams for making the inaugural final of the Severe Debate India Open. Through the suggestions. I would like to invite the
Demonetization was supposed to be a tool that would weed out corruption, tax the rich people who constantly evade the tax, help the poor people come into a better society. But what actually happened in this world was poor people were constantly made to stand in lines that were never ending, to stand in the beaming sun, would never get required medical attention because they didn't have cash in hand, while the rich would constantly sit in bars and pubs and drink how much ever they had because they had the infrastructure of cash, they had the infrastructure in terms of cards, they had money in their accounts which could let them take this low, but poor people were constantly subjugated, and this is the kind of move that we're constantly against. That is why we think Supreme Court has the right to come and step into these kinds of things. For the benefit of the House, I'll tell you what the context of the motion is on. So what happened in India recently was that there was an idea called demonetization, where a large part of cash of Indian currency was taken away and was replaced with a new oil currency, right? But what Indian government supposedly thought was that it could not give away half of the money, right? 15 lakh crores of amount of money was supposed to be in circulation. The point of time when they took back all this currency and decided only to give 7 or 8 lakh crores of money into circulation, they probably forced all the people to shift into online currency, and therefore they thought they can make a better world. But that's how not transacted. What happened to the taxpayers, and how did they manage to catch the black money holders, right? What happened was not much of black money was actually got back into circulation, right? Even after you got all the old 500 notes back into your accounts, in terms of more than 15 lakh crores of money, there's not much of black money that we found. Why? Because the tax evaders constantly found rules to constantly disengage this kind of machinery that was supposed to be hold them check, or things like that. What happened? Because India's infrastructure was extremely poor in terms of targeting these kinds of policies, catching these kinds of taxpayers' money. Right? Therefore, this decision or this kind of policy was in a hastened situation because they wanted to get certain political capital when we talking about my first speech. First, why is it extremely crucial that the Supreme Court step into this? Right? And I understand this. For any policy to work, it should be targeted at certain people who they think are problematic. Right? Therefore, the idea of demonetization and collecting black money from taxpayers is for mostly people who take tax, do money laundering, etc. But who did it affect the most? Right? It was the poor people who felt the brunt of the blow. Right? In terms of what? Because in terms of not getting daily wages, right? At a point of time, you force them to go into online currency. That is when small traders and small industries can't afford to pay daily wages, right? Because there's not enough money in their online transaction, and we can't show these kind of transactions because they don't have a certain amount of online currency, right? The point of time, they can't sustain to pay daily wages to people, and people can't take into this idea of daily wages. That is when they constantly laid off, right? Small industries can't buy certain goods and materials because therefore they can't sustain the industry. Right? Why can't they buy this kind of small small materials or in terms of daily labor? Is because there's no proper infrastructure that is being set up for these kinds of online currency. Right? The point of time will push the society to go into an online currency, push them to make every transaction online. You need to have certain amount of infrastructure that's already set up, right? As you know, India is extremely poorly set up in terms of infrastructure, in terms of online transactions, in terms of having banking sectors throughout the country. There's a large portion of the country that is constantly been in subjugation in terms of not having amount of knowledge to use these kinds of bank accounts, in terms of not having these kinds of cards constantly make transactions, right? Therefore, we feel the poor are disproportionately hurt in this kind of move, which a move is constantly targeted to the amount of taxpayers or the huge taxpayers. Therefore, we think Supreme Court is justified in terms of targeting taking away this policy because it disproportionately hurts, right? Second, why was it hastily done, right? Understand this. BJP came into power thinking they'll give them a change and people voted them with a lot of confidence, right? But what happened? Even 3 years down the line, there's no strong move from the BJP government to get back this black money in terms of helping people, right? Therefore, people constantly questioned Narendra Modi as to what we were doing for the Achedin, which is supposed to translate to having better days. When they constantly questioned him, that is when they had no access, right? And there's assembly elections, means there's elections in 5 states in next week, right? Therefore, there's constant people in the states ask them, what do you promise us in the future, right? Therefore, when Narendra Modi had no questions, that was he pulled the idea of nationalistic rhetoric, used this hasted policy to show that he's fighting black currency, but the end had no positive benefit on India, right? At the point of time, you use hasted policies, which has no benefit at the end of the day. We think that's when Supreme Court can step into our country. Why were people from this constantly hit on the idea of nationalistic rhetoric? Right? What was the only metric or what was the only reason that BJP gave the people or poor people who were affected with demonetization? Right? The only reason they gave is do it for the country. Right? They told it's okay, take the brunt of the sin for the country, for the greater good. Right? At a point of time when people's daily wages people or poor people whose voices weren't heard, at a point of time when mother is crying because the son couldn't get the treatment they wanted in the government hospital because there's no money they could pay them because there's less amount of cash transactions. We think that this was hit under the idea of nationalistic rhetoric, and that is why people's voices weren't heard. At the point of time where this kind of nationalistic rhetoric was coming, the point of time you question these kind of policies, that is why you deemed as anti-nationalists, you subjugated in the society, and the Supreme Court had to come up and tell them this is not the way you do it. You have to give back. Before that.
If the RBI were to substantially increase the interest rate, would you be okay with the Supreme Court intervening on the basis of some collateral damage?
See, it's not some collateral damage. Right? RBI has to show some concrete benefit at a point of time where you are taking away rights of people, when poor people are disproportionately hurt. You have to show them certain benefits, right? Even if you agree that going to online transactions is a good thing, it's not the time to do it. Right? Understand this. India's education system is extremely poor. Right? People don't know what a mobile phone is. People don't know what internet is. People don't know what online currency is. Right? At a point of time where you have a lot of people who are extremely well educated, but a lot of people who don't even have basic education. At a point of time where you push the society to become online transactions, that is when these people are disproportionately hurt, right? Because they can't meet up the expectations that the society puts up to you in terms of you using cash transactions, right? Therefore, it gives undue benefit to certain people who are educated in terms of them using online transactions to get their work done. But poor people who don't have the current education, who don't have the infrastructure to access certain banks, who can't access certain ATM machines, we think they are at a disadvantage, and that is why it's principally justified. Also, on the second argument of internet security, right? India's internet security is extremely backward, right? Banks don't have the online transactions don't have the current security that is there in the Western world, right? At a point of time, when you push poor people or gullible, like people who don't have education, to do these online transactions, that is when they're extremely gullible, right? You see rich people who constantly get trapped into internet scams. At a point of time, when these kind of poor people who are extremely gullible, give them this kind of scope of getting hurt. We think that is when Supreme Court can take a step up and take preemptive measures of stopping these kind of people, right? At a point of time when India's macro internet security isn't strong enough in terms of you can't secure India's currency limits, we tell you it's extremely problematic at a point of time. You should go on.
Can I start? Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not about the decision that came on November 8th, 2016. This debate is about what you do on Jan 16th, 2017. This debate is about knowing everything that has happened in the past 50 days, knowing the fact that people have incurred the kind of costs that they think are too bad. We think that it's about asking the question whether you need to put the entire country in the kind of financial uncertainty that they already experienced once, and that cost, and whether or not that cost was worth something or not. Another thing that they had to answer was why the Supreme Court has the mandate or has the power to enter into something which was obviously a policy decision. These are people who are judges, these are people who are decision makers in terms of law, not in terms of policy. We think that we think that them giving us a standard which is that poor people get affected, etc., while being wrong in itself, and I'll explain to you how, we think that that is not something which is a justification enough for the judiciary to intervene. Sit down. Let's talk about some context, right? And this is relevant context, Mr. Speaker. India has historically been a cash-reliant economy. It has in fact been a cash over-reliant economy to the extent that every single transaction, every single major transaction, good faith or bad faith, is one which has to be made in part in cash, because cash, by virtue of anonymity, is something which does not allow you to track the kind of transactions that are made. Therefore, and this is something, Mr. Speaker, which has pervaded to every single factor in the Indian economy, that any transaction that you make is something which has to be made part in cash, part in check, or part digitally, because they understand the fact, and it is so prevalent in the Indian economic sphere, that because of the fact that we can avoid tax by way of transacting in cash, because of the fact that if I am buying a house for $1 million, 1 million rupees, but now I can show on paper that I'm only spending 400,000 rupees, but actually getting 1 million, we think that the tax that they save on that 600 million is something which is a huge incentive for people to transact in cash. Therefore, we think that the context in this debate is one where the economy is designed in a way where perverse incentives have seeped right through every single structure in the Indian economy. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, it's important to understand the kind of radical move that is required. And we think that by carrying out a move which shifts you towards transactions which can be tracked, which shifts you towards transactions which are digital in nature, we think that large benefits occur on our side of the house. We think that simple logic is that when you can track a transaction, you can track whether or not it has to be taxed, and you can track the extent to which it has to be tracked. And we think that by virtue of that tracking, what happens is that the government automatically gets more revenue, and more importantly, the government can now capture a lot of the transactions that happen. And we think that if their problem is with respect to the poor, we think that a much wider tax base, both in terms of quantity and in terms of the people, is something which helps better poverty alleviation schemes that the government would want to push. We think that large amounts of currency is something which just goes unnoticed, and therefore the government's ability to tax is severely restricted because of cash. Secondly, corruption. We think that just by the same logic, bribery, nepotism, election campaign, election funding is all something which goes absolutely under the radar. And we think that it's important to understand the context behind this move. Mr. Modi was elected on a mandate of anti-corruption. He was elected on the mandate of curbing illicit trade. He was elected on the mandate of curbing tax evasion. We think therefore it's clear that national rhetoric and the national sentiment is one where people are fed up by the kind of tax evasion that people can carry out. And therefore, it's important that this not happen. Sixth, also, of course, by virtue of the fact that it's cash, a lot of horrible things like human trafficking, trade in arms, trade in counterfeit currency, illicit trade like in drugs, etc. is something which is curbed because of the fact that if you have fewer currency notes in circulation, the ability for you to carry out horrible things is reduced that much. Sixth, but more importantly, as I told you, that this is an election issue. This was something which was an election issue on the basis of which Mr. Modi got his mandate, but also that we agree that it's a radical move. We agree that it's something which has affected everyone. And therefore, it's important to understand that it's not something which is going to be rubbed off people's memory, which means that if digital penetration does not happen, if the kind of financial inclusion schemes that need to happen do not happen, it's something which is fatal to Mr. Modi's political career. And therefore, it is in his interest to carry out digitalization. So, Modi said, and because all the black money through this move, so well has that worked out for you? It's not relevant whether or not the decision on November 8th has worked or not. It's important for you to understand right now whether or not you can again pump the whole system with the kind of currency that you're talking about. And we think that 60 days, Mr. Speaker, is too little a time for you to have any sort of credible data for the kind of currency mechanism that you're talking about. So for them to say, how has it worked, we think it's too soon. We think now when you see the Economic Survey of India report coming on January 31st, when you see the union budget being tabled on February the 1st, is when you will have a clearer picture. But more importantly, it's important to understand that systems in India are already in place towards digitization, towards financial penetration. We think on the first count, telecom penetration is something which is unusually high in India. Around 90% of the population in India has cell phones, and we think that telecom companies in India have been very, very receptive to market realities. Cab ordering apps now book cabs by SMS. We think that PricewaterhouseCoopers was hired by Vodafone and Airtel to check out the rural viability of financial penetration for their mobile wallets. Additionally, we think that financial inclusion schemes like the Jan Dhan Yojana have been pushed specifically designed for this. We think all of this is geared towards a better system we are very proud to oppose.
I would like to speak about the proposition in the case of the opposition here.
These guys want to talk about the poor who suffer or who have suffered as a result of demonetization. What we ask you is, what about poor individuals who are denied proper infrastructure because the government does not have a taxable base from which it can redistribute that income? We ask you, what about the poor who are forced into professions that are facilitated through the access of cash that is unmonitored and anonymous? That's the question that you need to answer. But more importantly, that's not a question that a Supreme Court, which has no impact analysis, that hasn't scaled up the quality, the quality of that specific move across sample spaces, can necessarily take. The institution that is most appropriate to take such a decision is an institution that has the mandate of 1.2 billion people, that has been the most successful government in the recent past with the largest number of seats in Parliament. We suggest that this institution is more likely to be accountable, more likely to have done the background research, and more likely to be equipped to make policy decisions. Few bits of rebuttal before moving on to my argument about why this move is a particularly bad move at this point of time and why the Supreme Court ought not to be doing it. These guys want to give us a whole range of speculative theories about what happens as a result of demonetization. Osho gives you clear analysis as to how the argument works, right? Presumably cash remains anonymous,
Presumably cash is something that is remote, that can't be tied down to an individual, as opposed to an invoice that is generated, or the payment gateway like Visa or MasterCard that is intimated every time an individual makes the payment in their name. We think therefore the possibility of checking this is incredibly limited. Compare this nuance against the response that we get. Apparently people will send their servants to deposit these notes. First, purely speculative. It's incredibly unclear to what extent this happens. Second, that money is still accounted for when it goes into the bank. But more importantly, we're talking to you about costs that have already been incurred. This debate does not take place in November, it takes place now. When a system has already changed, there has been a modicum of adjustment towards the new circumstances. And what kind of adjustment am I talking about? Fourfold, right? We suggest that India is on its path, if slow, towards digitization. 4 reasons why. First, notice that internet penetration, telecommunication penetration in specific in India, irrespective of its education standards, is particularly high, right? We talked to you about how even players like Airtel and Vodafone are using M-Paisa, which worked out in Africa, to introduce mobile wallets and conduct qualitative assessments of how those mobile wallets will work in rural areas as well. The government has initiated a program called the Jan Yojana, or the Aadhaar card program, or giving everyone an Aadhaar card immediately after demonetization. That means everyone is given access de facto to a bank account as such. More importantly, most payment gateways have started including mobile wallet, including banks like the State Bank of India as well. But finally, even if you think you're confused about facts and don't know much about demonetization, ask yourself structurally. This is a man, Modi or Arun Jaitley, who has hinged his reputation on being an anti-corruption Mughal, who has hinged his reputation on ridding India of the scourge of black money and corruption. Ask yourself, if this move were to fail, is he likely to get elected again in 2019, even if you don't buy the many facts that we have spoken to you about, right? Look, the question here is simple. These guys can argue that poor people have suffered as a result. We can contest that, but more importantly, we suggest that poor people are routinely adjusted to this process. Money is still going to be there in the system. A significant portion of it is going to become digitized, and in the long run, presumably, we're going to phase this out. We don't see why there will continue to be the humanitarian crisis that these guys want to characterize, especially given the government has incentives to take care of this problem and has done so in the past. It's not as if everyone is silenced when they speak out against it. In fact, prominent economists have also, for instance, again, prominent economists have come in support of it, but that's not the problem. Prominent economists have also questioned this move. In fact, the liberal bubble in which I live is filled with demonetization hatred, right? The Wire, which is like the Indian version of Vox or Slate, continuously talks about this as such, right? It's not entirely clear why dissent is especially silenced in this specific instance. That was just a baseless assertion, right? Now that I've explained to you in very brief as to why they never actually dealt with Osho's model of benefits that demonetization necessarily brings, let's talk about why it's important that this move not be taken now and why the Supreme Court is incapable of taking this move. Understand that monetary policy, and specifically concerning the Reserve Bank of India, involves an analysis or an understanding of how the population in general will respond. This involves things like qualitative assessments of how it will work out across different sample spaces. Even if politicians don't do it all the time, one, they have the mandate to do it because presumably they've been elected by a vast majority of individuals, but two, they're not assured of this success, right? And the reason we allow them to enact these policies, even though the success is not assured, and even if we don't prove the success, is because they're the only ones who are qualified to do so, and B, they can be held accountable in case they fail. Let's compare that against courts. Courts, and the Supreme Court in specific, can probably read a bunch of articles on scroll.in, which is like, let's say, the Slate of India, right? And decide that demonetization is a bad thing. Poor people are continuing to get screwed over, even though, for instance, they are accommodating to the system. We think that court is uniquely incapable of looking at the broader picture. And the broader picture, Mr. Speaker, if you ask the general populace as opposed to the liberal debating bubble, is that they're okay to bear these costs. They're okay because they believe that corruption is such a big scourge, that black money is such a big scourge. To tell them that this trade-off is unacceptable because your liberal elite bubble thinks it affects a couple of individuals whom you think they should be caring more about than the country as a whole is patronizing and just unacceptable, right? Let's talk about why courts again are uniquely incapable of taking this burden. Go.
So if India is already in the roadmap of digitization, why do you want to force it at a point of time there's already organic change?
Listen, we think, okay, here's what demonetization has done, right? It's removed our over-reliance on cash as such. Sure, I wasn't going to suggest that India was anyway on its path to digitization. I was suggesting that India has the infrastructure to cope with digitization if it has been imposed on it, right? That's why I gave you 4 structural reasons. Stop misrepresenting me in the name of POI, right? Let's talk about why the Supreme Court is incredibly incapable of doing this and why it should not be doing this, right? Couple of reasons very quickly. First, because the Supreme Court is presumably unelected. Yeah. Second, because the Supreme Court in specific is more likely to be composed of elite, upper caste individuals who presumably come from incredibly privileged backgrounds. But thirdly, this idea that Supreme Courts can make decisions about trade-offs, which every policy measure, every radical policy, any like a multi-scale project or like an MNC entering into India or creating SEZs in India or liberalization is a horrible precedent to set, because Supreme Courts, as I explained, are uniquely incapable of making this decision, of taking this value judgment as to which side can better serve the interest of the population. Understand this. All of what the harms they spoke about are things that we have already suffered. If you enact their policy, that suffering would be in vain. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Can I start? Mr. Speaker, at this very point in time, people still don't have any money in hand and they still don't know anything about online transactions. They lose money today because of lack of knowledge. They dwindled out of their savings today because of lack of knowledge, and it's purely because of this move, right? So even though costs have been incurred already, we believe that it's getting worse. They're incurring worse and worse losses at this point in time, which is why we need to do this now. So before moving on to clashes, one piece of extraneous rebuttal in terms of whether people are essentially able to question this move or not. So even if you come up here and tell us that prominent economists have come out and spoken against this particular move, even they have been shut out in the name of national rhetoric. More and more people have gone ahead and flung their own ideas of them being anti-national simply because they have spoken against this move, as opposed to listening to their logical reasons behind it. And even if we don't consider that particular possibility, we don't believe that poor people essentially look to these economists and find it and find the guts to actually go ahead and speak about the losses incurred to themselves, right? So people essentially aren't able to question this move under their paradigm. So firstly, in terms of whether the Supreme Court has the right to step into what the RBI does, right? So things like, we get that a lot of things that the RBI does, the Supreme Court doesn't necessarily step into. That's because most of those are not directly attacking a particular set of people within your own country, right? And a lot of their case is predicated on the fact that the Supreme Court necessarily will mess up in the way that they analyze this particular move, or the Supreme Court is not going to like check up on facts. So we tell you that the Supreme Court is not going to take this lightly. These guys are pros. They're going to evaluate the pros and cons and do a cost-benefit analysis of what exactly they're doing. You simply asserting that these guys are noobs is not going to win you this debate. And we don't care about like whether Arun Jaitley or like Modi are going to retain their post in the near future simply because of the independence of this particular body. So given the fact, given the fact that the RBI isn't going to do it because they've hinged their reputation on it, Modi isn't going to do it because he's hinged his reputation on it, we realize that the only body that can do it at this particular stage is the Supreme Court. And we have seen like examples of Supreme Court stepping into things like when people want to build like flyovers in a particular place, we notice that these issues are necessarily taken into court. It's not like the Supreme Court is isolated from all these particular moves. So let's deal with the benefit that they have. Let's deal with the benefit that they had on their side of the house. Does our paradigm actually dramatically increase black money or increase corruption? What did they tell? They told you can't track the money and the government needs revenue in order to build infrastructure. But they need to live in reality. You are essentially capturing people, like what Modi and the BJP and the media are doing is that every time they capture someone who has a lot of black money, they overplay it or over-exaggerate it in the media. The number of successful raids has been highly over-exaggerated simply because it's their legacy. We get it. They want to like show off proudly as to how many bad people they're catching. But the reality is that people still have black money in terms of assets, they still have black money in terms of gold. And the problem with this is people get other people to create accounts for them. This is a reality that they haven't engaged with on their side of the house. So notice that India doesn't necessarily like tax accounts that have less than 2.5 lakhs. So what these rich moguls have essentially done is that they've told given bribes to 100 different people to create 100 different accounts and input 2.5 lakhs into all of those accounts. I'm not going to do the math because like I'm not very good at it. Please sit down. Is India ready to accept online transactions, right? So, yeah. So what was their characterization like? They're like, no, it's okay. We're moving towards an era where people can actually do it, right? So the problem is that the characterization of booking cabs and things like that, it's not something that poor people essentially do, right? It's not poor people who essentially had cash previously actually go ahead and do. The amount to which, the degree to which poor people currently use online transactions has been over-exaggerated on their part. So please, I'll take you just a minute. So what happens under their paradigm? People essentially are forced to use things like Paytm, right? So something that they haven't engaged with is how hard that actually is, right? So you find people in nooks and corners of the country who have had to travel to banks and had to stand in line in order to deposit money, right? So these people in the nooks and crannies and in rural areas don't necessarily know how to use these online transactions. This is a reality that they have to engage with. This is the most vulnerable set that they have targeted with their particular, which Modi has targeted unintentionally with this particular policy, and we don't see the point of harming them disproportionately. People are still getting used to things like ATM cards. They don't even know what a PIN means, right? They lose money on these particular accounts, and there's general mistrust of things like online payments. One second. Yeah. So when they come up and tell us that, okay, banks can give demos and banks can go ahead and, provide seminars and bring in people to educate them, can happen on either paradigm. The problem is it hasn't been done to a degree yet where people are ready to transition out of using cash and into using online payments. We're still, yeah.
The most downloaded app on Google Play in India is a browser which is designed to consume low data, obviously downloaded primarily by the poor. Engage with the fact that everyone has a phone and everyone is not as change averse as you paint them to be. Stop fear mongering.
Yeah, okay, so everybody, they claim that everybody in the country essentially has a phone, right? So look how long that particular process took. The process for you to actually go ahead, download these various apps and put them in your phone, learn how to use them is not as simple as side opposition would like you to believe. And there are a lot of people who don't essentially know how these things work. Please engage with that reality, right? So, and another thing we spoke about that they didn't engage with was the internet security at this very point in time. If you're forcing people to essentially use online transactions and online bank accounts, at least ensure that the internet security is good. They haven't even done that. It's very weak. People can still swindle money in and out of bank accounts, right? So what we tell you is that even if you put out cash into the public, you can, like, stronger regulation can still work on our side of the house, because clearly their attempt to reduce the amount of black money in the market isn't working in this particular scenario we're proud to propose.
I would like to ask you that speech, and I'd like to invite you to
Mr. Speaker, there are three clashes in this debate. First, is this move more beneficial? Is it more beneficial to have a cashless, digitized economy? Second, is this the right time for the Supreme Court to reverse Modi's digitization of our economy? And third, is the Supreme Court the most legitimate body to make this call? Before I move on to analyze these clashes, a simple line on burdens. These clashes are disjunctive for side opposition. For us to win, we only need to win one of these clashes. The burden on side government is to win all three. Let's get to the first clash. Is it more beneficial to have a more cashless, digitized economy? What do we hear from side government? They say demonetization has caused poor people to suffer. They're standing in the sun, they're wasting time, they don't get wages. Yes, of course, there are inconveniences and harms caused to the impoverished. We don't deny that, but you have to determine whether the short-term harm caused by the process of digitization outweighs the long-term benefits of digitization. What are the benefits that we've talked to you over the course of our speech? We've talked to you about how it becomes much harder to have black money, which means more taxes being paid and collected by the government. We talked to you about how it significantly tackles the issue of illegal trade, whether it's in child pornography, in sex, in drugs, in arms, or human trafficking, because all of this can now be monitored because all cash transactions are happening online. We told you how this reduces the possibility of corruption and creates more effective bureaucracy because you simply can't hide your money. All of this harms the poor. All these activities which are being tackled by digitization harm the poor just as much, if not more. Because when rich people don't pay taxes and the government can't provide them poor food, medicine, or housing, they die. When corrupt middlemen steal from the public food distribution system, taking away the earnings of farmers and the food that's meant for people who are starving, people die. When illegal trade is allowed in sex and human trafficking, which disproportionately targets lower caste women and children, then also poor people die. So if this debate is about harm to the poor, we think that the short-term harm suffered by the poor can be justified given that the tremendous long-term benefits of a digitized economy provided by us are greater. What do they say in response? DPM says, look, you can still avoid tax because you can set up fake accounts somehow, not really analyzed, to which we have two responses. A, bank accounts are currently linked to your Aadhaar card or your PAN card, which means they directly connect to your identity. Paytm and mobile wallets are also linked to your mobile numbers, which are granted to you by phone providers only when you provide them with a government ID. Again, directly linking you to your identity. Even to the extent that you buy that argument that it may be possible still to evade taxes, it's certainly much harder. Most of the benefits provided you still stand. The second response they say to this argument is it's risky to shift our economy to the online system because it's all fallible. Again, assertive. We tell you our economy is already entirely dependent on the internet and telecom because if it were to crash, our stock market would crash, our entire banking system would crash, and our GDP would be entirely screwed over, for lack of a more stronger word, which means that the harm that they're talking about is not something new that our move creates, and is therefore not something to be valued in this debate. Because even if we lose the first clash, we can win on this. Is this the right time for the Supreme Court to reverse Modi's digitization of our economy? This is important because we're not debating whether demonetization should have been carried out, but rather, now that it has been carried out, should we still go ahead with the goal of digitizing our economy? Why is this relevant? Because it means that the worst of the harms that side government is talking about have already been suffered. The worst harms that are suffered when there is no infrastructure for digitized economy took place in the last 50 days, and those harms acted as a catalyst, a stimulus for both the government and individuals to shift to the online infrastructure that we're trying to create. What has happened in the last 50 days? The government has distributed card machines to people. Paytm has been adopted by almost all small businesses. They usually walk around the road to see that. Phone companies and banks have set up mobile wallets and M-Pesa all around, and people have already been forced to adopt these changes in order to survive. In addition to this, the Jan Dhan program was also enacted right before demonetization, which means everyone has a bank account and access to the digitized economy. It's only going to get easier from this point onwards to create more infrastructure. We also give you incentives as to why the government will create this infrastructure. The government has strong incentives because there's an election in 2019, which is based entirely now on their campaign about ridding the country of corruption and solving the issue of black money, which means they're likely to create this infrastructure necessary because in order for this move to be successful, you necessarily need to make it accessible to the poor, because guess what? The poor constitute the largest vote bank, and that's what Modi got elected on the first time. If you screw them over and you don't give them this infrastructure and you let them die, they're probably not going to vote for you again, which means there's an incentive for you to create this infrastructure in the first place. But if the Supreme Court strikes it down now, all this harm that you've suffered will be for nothing, because the cash will come back, people will again not pay their taxes, human trafficking will again pick up, corruption will happen again, and all the worst harms that you're talking about that we've already suffered would have been for nothing, and all the harms that we're trying to tackle will also occur. The world will be far worse off. Before I get to the third clash on whether the Supreme Court is the most legitimate body to make this call, I'll take up the word.
So most businesses are dealt with people who understand the concept of debt and credit, but unfortunately not the concept of apps and downloading. How do you deal with these people to run the majority of your businesses?
That's just ridiculously presumptuous and condescending. We think that given the fact that everyone, like we've given you analysis, telecom penetration is deep, people have mobile phones, we think they are capable of using apps. Indians are not some inherently worse off at using apps. I don't know analysis on that also. We can't analyze that. Which brings me to the final clash. Is the Supreme Court the most legitimate body to make this call? The Prime Minister justified this by saying, poor people are suffering, so let's let the Supreme Court intervene. The Deputy Prime Minister realized that that's not really a great principle to justify Supreme Court intervention, so he said, when there isn't a feedback mechanism for the poor to express their views, then the Supreme Court intervene. First, slight shifting principle, but even if we accept that, who are you to say that the poor aren't being able to express their views? Which study are you referring to that shows that poor people oppose this move more? Is that study more representative in the general election of 2014, which was on the campaign of black money and corruption being tackled? All the articles, the news articles the government is referring to are written by the liberal press, which are newspapers and channels owned by the wealthy, who presumably are sad that they can't evade taxes. Why is that important? It means the public outcry they're referring to from government isn't that of the poor, it's of the wealthy. The poor have not even been asked this question, which is why you have to ask yourself, and the whip says that obviously the Supreme Court will assess the pros and cons of this move. We say the government is better equipped to assess those pros and cons for two reasons. First, they have a democratic mandate specifically to do that, because 1.2 billion people have chosen Modi specifically on the plank of anti-corruption. But second, the Supreme Court is not better equipped to make this call because they're trained in questions of law, and this is a question purely of policy, which is precisely what politicians are elected for. You're violating the principles of separation of judiciary and executive. You're doing it to harm poor people more than the benefits provided to them, and you're doing it at the worst time possible with a very powerful force.
At the end of this debate, they had a pretty steep burden, right? Because they needed to show you conclusively that this policy was a bad thing. And that's why we stand to gain. Because even if we show you that its impacts on the poor that we want to talk about, both short-term and long-term, are ambiguous, the Supreme Court cannot intervene, because the Supreme Court does not have a clear idea. But moreover, the Supreme Court simply does not have the mandate. But I will not press that point because there's no engagement. Let's talk about where there was engagement. Question number one. Is the policy, is the pivot towards digitization necessarily a good thing? Let's compare the impacts that we have presented against the sort of presumed impacts that they want to talk about. Osho and me and Vanshaj, to some extent, provide concrete analysis as to why we think why we think digitization is a particularly good idea in tackling the malaise that haunts Indian society. We're talking to you about corruption, we're talking to you about black money, we're talking to you about illicit trade, all of whom happen to affect the poor the most, right? We gave you structural reasons as to how this happens, in terms of the fact that it's impossible to track payments right now, that in the future invoices will be issued, individuals will be notified, it will be tied down to their Aadhaar cards, like their UID, unique identification card, or their PAN card, by means of which they can necessarily be identified. Apart from small qualms about how this will be implemented and how some people might evade the system by sending out their servants or by creating bank accounts in other individuals' names, we didn't really see a concrete enough response to deal with all the benefits of demonetization. That's digitization, right? Why was this important in this debate? Because what it meant is that in the long term, the poor are better off when they have access to a greater taxable base, when they're less likely to be involved in illicit trades, when they are less likely to be subject to corruption. So they don't actually have an answer to who serves the interests of the poor in the long term. But the second level on which they fail is in establishing who affects the poor more in the short term, right? They tried to tell us by a bunch of assertions as to how businesses are created on the basis of cash and how creating apps and like using a bank account and creating like a Paytm wallet is an incredibly difficult thing, right? We gave you several reasons to talk to why that was in fact possible. We talked to you about telecom penetration in India, right? We spoke to you towards how every individual has now been given a bank account. We've also given you structural reasons, even if you don't buy the facts, as to why probably the BJP necessarily has a powerful incentive to follow up by providing the infrastructure necessary, especially if they've hinged their legacy and hinged their 2019 campaign and a variety of state campaigns that is going to happen in the recent future on this specific move. The only response that we hear is apparently you can't question this move because you will be seen as anti-national. We pointed out that's not strictly true. You see a vast majority of liberal newspapers or prominent economists like Amartya Sen, you've probably all heard of, questioning this move as such. It's not to indicate the move is bad, but it's to indicate that there is a sufficient quality of dissent. So their only standard on the basis of which the Supreme Court can intervene is that there is no check mechanism. We've told you there is a check mechanism. There's check in terms of being called out, and there is a check in terms of elections where the poor can actually question the specific move. Finally, on the question of why the Supreme Court ought not to intervene in these sort of things, the answer is quite simple. The Supreme Court does not intervene when a policy goes wrong or thinks the policy is specifically bad. One, because there is no objective criteria on the basis of which the Supreme Court, based on the resources it has, can decide that policy is bad. We spoke to you from my speech about things like impact assessment and why it's specifically necessary in policy making. Why politicians, even if they don't do it all the time, still have the mandate, still have the capacity that people support them in order to do these sort of things. This meant that the Supreme Court cannot intervene on dubious standards like some people don't like my policy or that the trade-offs involve some some suffering on behalf of some sections of the population, especially when the impact in and of itself was something that was inconclusive at the end of this debate. Incredibly proud to propose.
I would like to have a speaker on stage, and that's what the Deputy Governor provides with chair.
Four clashes in this debate, right? Firstly, does all of their advantage stand? Will they effectively be able to collect all of the taxes and therefore accrue all the benefits of collecting taxes? Fairly obvious. Secondly, is the trade-off worth it? That if poor people are hurt, is it all right? Thirdly, does Supreme Court have a mandate to interfere? And fourthly, how does this whole atmosphere of online transactions work in totality? Right? Firstly, does all of their benefits stand? We don't think that their responses such as, oh, we'll link it with Aadhaar card and things like that stands in this debate, right? For several things. One is pure fact that you don't need to associate it with your Aadhaar card, which is very similar to social security number, if it's an account that's less than 2.5 lakhs. These kind of trade-offs that make it very, and even if the system is absolutely rigid, there are loopholes like this tend to exist, and all of the rich who want to evade those taxes want to make use of these things. Because even if you look at demonetization as proposed in November, when they said that you will no longer be able to use your 500 and 1,000 rupees note, even though all of the black money was in that, there was around 80 crore new accounts that were generated just to facilitate these individuals to somehow channel in their black money and then get it back in the new accounts. We think this system exists, right? They can't take away the idea that, oh, they have a very efficient system in order to collect taxes. We think it still remain very close to status quo. You might catch one or two like fairly middle class people who are doing some sort of a tax evasion, but you'll never be able to catch the big bucks. You'll never be able to catch many of the other people who are evading taxes. We don't think that benefits stand on their paradigm at all. Next, is the trade-off worth it? Is the trade-off of like one should say, screwing over the black people worth it, right? Look at how like
insulting it is in terms of how policies, like he says, is targeted in somehow troubling the black people anyway, right? Like the logical extension of that argument is, if there's a minority rebel, take your army, shoot them down. Why do you want to spend time and money giving them bribes and other resources, right? That's simply not an argument. We think with India, when majority of the businesses are the kinds in which that are traditional, and you have learned your skills of business from your father, and therefore that's the only kind of exposure to the kind of businesses that you do. They never tackled that idea on their side at all. How are people willing to adopt to this new kind of system, even though there's like certain things that are blocking them to do that? They never argued any of those things. We think that a couple of things here. One is tradition. Secondly, we think the skepticism is something that simply cannot be avoided, right? Like, how are you convincing on your end that all the things that your father and forefathers, the way they were dealing with business, you have to do it somehow differently? It's not a joke when I say that people don't understand concepts of mobile phone and how it works. Some new generation people might, but most of those who are old, most of those who have not seen these kind of things, simply don't see these kind of things. It's not an unreality. But most importantly, where is the infrastructure that is being set out, right? If you have to have a mobile phone in everyone's hand and give them the access of internet, like no argument about how, even if you take Google, who's establishing that Google Balloon and things like that to provide internet in places where they can't give Ethernet cables, even in those places, this is a hypothetical concept that simply cannot be possible to run on the large scale. To sacrifice the poor and these who make the majority of business and economy in the country is not a viable trade-off at all. Finally, Supreme Court's mandate, right? Let's look at how this plays out in the debate. We told you, like, look, there is a sector of society that's being, again, screwed over, and therefore you have to ensure that that's not the case. Do these individuals have the efficient mechanism to address this in terms of backlash, in terms of way voicing out that this is our concern, therefore please stop things like this? We would rather trade with money. We don't think they have that sort of a machinery at all. To an extent where the minority in a state is not able to voice out their concern, we think it's absolutely the mandate of Supreme Court to step in and ensure that minorities are protected. The minorities turned out to be majority in this debate because poor people are more in India, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Further to the question of you, and one round of applause for the speaker.